Bom dia, boa tarde a todas, todos, todes, quem não se reconhece com esses pronomes. Meu nome é João Reis, sou coordenador da cátedra Sérgio Vieira de Mello na UFG. Ainda que a gente tenha nessa mesa participantes que sejam brasileiros, essa é a mesa internacional do nosso evento. Essa é uma mesa que a gente vai estar falando em inglês para atingir um número maior de pessoas, para receber pessoas também que têm experiências e ideias de outros lugares. Eu gostaria de chamar a atenção que as perguntas podem ser feitas tanto em português quanto em inglês. Se elas forem feitas em português, a gente vai traduzir elas para ampliar o debate, mas podem ser feitas em ambas as línguas através do chat. Eu peço licença agora, então, para falar em inglês, que é a língua dessa mesa redonda. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody who is watching us. It is my great pleasure to introduce such a distinct panel of stars. The panel is entitled Race, Class, and the Global Refugee Regime, and I am here to give my warmest welcome to you all. I will pass the floor to my dear friend, Professor Florian Hoffman, who will conduct the panel. Florian Hoffman is Professor of Law at the Pontifícia Universidade Católica do Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Prior to his current appointment, he taught at the University of Erfurt, Germany, and at the London School of Economics, UK. His work has focused on the interface between law and politics, with his main research interests having been in international law, human rights, and international legal theory. Florian, welcome. The floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here.
Muito obrigado, João. Boa tarde a todos, bom dia. Eu vou trocar para o inglês agora, justamente isso é o nosso painel internacional. Peço compreensão por essa opção, porque, obviamente, pelo menos um dos nossos panelistas, o Samson, justamente nós vai entender ele em inglês, então por isso se deve a isso, mas mais uma vez queria reiterar que o que o João falou, que as perguntas depois de intervenções, comentários podem ser feitos tanto em português quanto em inglês. Se for português, a gente vai traduzir aqui ao vivo para o Samson. Okay, so welcome everyone to this debate. This is one of our international panels. It's a particular pleasure to be able to be here for this national conference of the Cátedra Sérgio Vieira de Mello. Several universities in the state I'm based in, Rio de Janeiro, had an opportunity a couple of years ago to host this great event, and we're very grateful for the UFG to host it this year. We know this is a lot of work, whether virtual and online or presential, and I think we should all always, while watching this, thank the organizers in the background for having done this tremendous effort. This is particularly important because I think refugee studies in Brazil is still in a constitutive phase, and I think to have this opportunity for all of us to meet, even if only in virtual form, is, I think, extremely important. And I hope that today's panel will also contribute to that and broaden our horizon and reflection on this. And I'm extremely glad to be counting on three fantastic panelists. Now we have Sam Okoth Opondo, who's a associate professor in political science and Africana studies at Vassar College in New York in the United States. His research focuses on the dynamics of mediating estrangement and the ethics of aesthetics of cohabitation and aesthetics of cohabitation in settler colonial and post-colonial societies. He has written an enormous amount of both academic articles as well as short fiction and on this area or these themes and often overlooked amateur diplomacies of everyday life, post-colonial cities, the politics of genre, migrant and cultural translation in Africa. He is, amongst others, the author of Diplomatic Para-Citations, Genre, Foreign Bodies, and the Ethics of Cohabitation, which came out last year. And he co-edited with Michael Shapiro The New Violent Cartography, Geoanalysis after the Aesthetic, which came out in 2012. I'm also extremely glad to welcome back to Brazil Natalia Sintra, who is a former PhD student here at PUC-Rio in the law department, and is currently a research fellow in the project Redressing Gendered Health Inequalities of Displaced Women and Girls in Situations of Protracted Displacement in Central and South America at the School of Economic, Social and Political Science at the University of Southampton in the United Kingdom. And she defended her PhD. Goodness, Natalia, you'll have to rectify me, but I think it was last year. No? It wasn't 2 years ago. It was last year. No? Or was it 2 years ago? No, it was last year. Yeah, she defended last year. Time passes so very fast. And and she, of course, focuses in her research on migration, asylum, and the intersections of race and gender in Latin America. And is, of course, as many of us, also actively involved in civil society organizations in the area of migration and refugees. And thirdly, I am very happy to welcome a current PhD student of ours here, Leilane Santos, who is also one of the founding operatives of the Rio, or the Brazil office of race and equality, an important NGO on the on various themes of race. Leilane works, however, on another very protracted topic in migration studies, which is environmental displacement and the question of how this can be normatively accommodated, also from from the perspective of sort of racialized issues that arise within this context. And I'm extremely glad. I think this is going to be a really nice panel. I will now pass the word to the panelists. I think each panelist will give some initial observations for about 15-ish minutes, and then we'll have a quick rejoinder for the panelists to be able to react to each other's comments also briefly, and then we will be more than glad to include the wider audience and take on questions or comments to discuss this. We have up to, I understand, 15:30 Brazil time, so we have roughly an hour and a half, now slightly less. And I'll be obviously watching the time for you, don't worry. So anyways, without further ado, I'm I would like to pass and give the word to Sam, who I once again welcome here virtually, at least to Brazil, hopefully in the future also presentially, physically, and anyways, we're very glad that you could make it. Thank you. Please.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me? All right.
Yes, absolutely. Perfect.
All right. No, thank you, Florian, for the very generous introduction. Thank you, Joao, for the invitation to be part of this conversation. And I'm really looking forward to the exchanges that Lillian and Natalia and myself will have with others today. My interventions today will be theoretical, and in order to raise other questions. And this is primarily because posing a conversation on migration, racism, and xenophobia can sometimes move very quickly towards problem solving, rather than problematization. As we all know, the question of xenophobia is not only a racial question. It could be the question of religious others, as we see in places like India, where that kind of difference is what becomes the marker of xenophobia in certain places. It can be a marker of caste or other markers of difference. So I want to be able to come round to this question a little bit theoretically, and then at the same time to attempt to address some of the issues that the panel is engaging. So I'll ask you to be a little bit patient when I go in a roundabout way. Moving quickly to tie these three things together sometimes takes the question of race, migration, and xenophobia as settled. It also takes the citizen subject as the normative subject that we try to engage and therefore address in our analysis. To make these theoretical interventions, I want to begin with a reflection on a short story written by Yvonne Adhiambo War. It's called The Weight of Whispers. This is a story about the empire of silence and the many things that, when said, set the home or the world that we are at home in ablaze. A world where notions of identity and irreducible alterity are becoming more prevalent. A world where discourses of non-contamination or threat are limiting the possibilities of amateur diplomacies, and where new genres of man are constantly being mobilized to mediate the encounter between various populations, where race and even the language of post-racial imaginations are sometimes being mobilized, such that our ideas of community, immunity, and superfluity, or even the rights of man and the right to have rights, are constantly being raised again and again. As Achille Mbembe puts it, this order of relations is manifested in the formations of universalism and asymmetrical fraternity, Orientalism and xenophobia, as well as a post-racial radical indifference to difference, which translates to an indifference to discrimination of various forms. There is also a desire for purity and immunitary regimes that often turn the problem of living together into one of, and I quote Mbembe again here, proximity without reciprocity, while concretizing the sacrificial conception of the nation, the people, and belonging. Consider, for example, the multiple worlds and homes, or even forms of homelessness that Boniface Kuseremane, the story's protagonist, experience and inhabits. From the opening passages of Wolf's short story, we meet Boniface being harassed by a policeman in Nairobi. And in other scenes, we see how this Rwandese elite moves between various European cities, where his conversations with academics, diplomats, and sovereign others raises questions about the human condition. In all these instances, Boniface Kuseremane is a man of the world, a cosmopolitan figure who moves through the world because he can, the kind of movement that a diplomatic passport enables one to engage. So for me, my research on diplomacy of necessity also makes me very concerned about the world of refuge and migrancy. Yeah, I think of this as almost being in a continuum. The carriers of the diplomatic passport and the privileges and immunities that they are able to have, moving from city to city, yeah, oftentimes non-discriminated. Of course, there are other kinds of discriminated, and the people who are undocumented, the people who do not carry the same type of paper and cannot move through the world in the same way. So as a diplomatic figure, Boniface Kuseremane moves through the world because he can, and as a master of his home and through reciprocal gestures, he's received as a diplomatic guest. However, owing to the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, and to the loss of mastery of his home and homeland, he's thrown into a world of estrangement and strangers, where his encounters question the law of the home, the familiar and familial logics that secured his place in society and in the home, and calls for hospitality and refuge that the immigrant's quest for safety often incites. As a royal family in flight from hostility at home, the first place, the transit zone that Boniface Kuseremani's family turns to is the Hilton Hotel in Nairobi, again owing to the class that he is part of and the diplomatic credentials that he has had this far. Yeah, he's not someone who will be taken to a refugee camp. He goes to the city and goes to the hotel. However, the place of transit soon becomes a site of capture, a city where the Kuseremane family must learn how to live with or even die with each other anew. The foreign land also becomes a place where the affective economy that fuels attachment to the home and the homeland is revealed and disturbed, and where hostility and hospitality comes from unexpected places. It is a place where colonial maps, language, barriers, and national attachments reveals the working of, in the Rwandese context, the Hamitic hypothesis that was being used by colonial missionaries and anthropologists to be able to grade the different native populations. A hypothesis that racialized the Hutu-Tutsi difference in Rwanda rather than ethnicized it, such that the Hutu, as the Tutsi, as Mahmoud Mamdani illustrates, were constructed as non-natives, even if colonized, and thus occupied the contradictory middle ground between settler citizens and nativized subjects. People who could be exterminated in the name of nativity or even nationalism, or even the imagined boundaries of humanity. Yvonne Ward's Weight of Whispers illustrates how the question of the migrant, the quest of the asylum seeker, the rejection or reception of this being from elsewhere also points back to questions of foreignness, passage, thresholds, and the limits or origins that are often taken for granted. As Jacques Derrida puts it, the foreigner is a being in question who, in being questioned, also puts us in question. A being who has the capacity to reveal how we are always already strangers to ourselves, and how the quest for certainty or pure identity of one form or another makes us hostile to strangers of various forms and the kinds of questions that they raise. It makes one xenophobic and sometimes colonial. So for me, the colonial question is something that I'd like us to reflect on, even as we are thinking about xenophobia, refuge, migrancy. And the reason that I point that out, and it's good that this is in a Brazilian context, that sometimes you can move very quickly and ask, how can we be hospitable and less xenophobic to the non-national other, and gloss over the question of foreignness in the Brazilian context that has to be historicized, that overlooks the question of indigeneity, for instance, such that the question of host-guest relations or the questions of conquest are not part of the question of xenophobia in our given context. Of the many questions that the foreigner raises, or those that are directed towards the foreigner, the question of the home and identity is central. The question of the birthplace and the proper place, the journey and the way of death and co-dying, and ultimately hospitality is also raised again and again. Derrida puts it well when he states, and I quote, "It is the birthplace which will always be underpin the definition of the stranger as non-autochthonous, non-indigenous, and the place of death. The stranger is, first of all, he who is born elsewhere. The stranger is defined from birth rather than death, the dying elsewhere, or the dying at home," end of quote. The reality of the home as an open question and hospitality as a questioning of the culture or even the idea of the home calls upon us to question the cultures of death, natality, purity, immunity, and sovereignty that are often taken for granted within modernity, and the idea of foreignness that they produce, such that indigenous peoples are sometimes cast outside the circle of hospitality due to settler colonialism's reconfiguration of who is a guest, who is a host in a given society, and the multiplicity of arrivants and racial hierarchies that emerge in its wake. To pose the foreigner question as a question shakes the threatening dogmatism and the paternal logos, the chief or the father, the master or the family house, as Derrida puts it. And in response to this threat of the violation or questioning, hospitality or the quest for hospitality can fold into hostility through a privatizing familialist reaction that Derrida also notes widens the ethnocentric and nationalist circle and even the xenophobic circle. In this sense, the welcoming gesture, that which I think we are all concerned with, the ability to say, I welcome you as a host, very easily becomes a sovereign injunction. Yeah, I can expel you, I can hold you at bay, I can hold you hostage, such that the laws of hospitality, just like those of diplomacy, become tied to identity and ipseity without questioning them. This being the case, I'll conclude shortly. This being the case, hospitality becomes a case of avowing the impossible, as absolute or unconditional hospitality presupposes a break with the hospitality in the regular sense, and it involves risking openness to the unknown, the uninvited, and as Derrida puts it, it involves a deconstruction of the home. A few more remarks and then a question that I'd like us to reflect on as a panel. For me, come not only by reading Michel Aour's Weight of Whispers, but by looking at works like Michel Agier's reflection on migrancy and the city and even the city camp. Michel Agier illustrates how most precarious life exists in places that are set apart, of places that have a role as places of refuge, a shelter created in a hostile context, whether war or xenophobia, whose permanence often turns into a ghetto. For Agier, the formation of the ghetto is part of the urban logic today, and if the city begins with asylum, from refuge, the ghetto is born, he puts it. Turning to this theme of hospitality that I want us to reflect on, Agier notes that hospitality favors sharing the city as a common space, but it also involves questioning the kind of topography that we take as that either of citizenship or of migrancy. And it involves even questioning the way we think about the connection between identity and place and territory. This is something that people like Lisa Malky have also raised. And for Malky, it's asking a critical question about the extraterritoriality that is always part of how we think about migrancy. Like the characters in Weight of Whispers, theorists and these are ethnographers like Michel Agier and Lisa Malky turn to foreigners to raise critical ethical questions. And I'll just pose these three questions as something that are part of our invitation to think with together, especially given the very empirical questions that my co-panelists are engaging. And these are the questions. First, how do we think about the intimate linkages between people and places? Secondly, in what ways are the notions of natives and nativeness being complicated when people identify themselves according to deterritorialized homelands and cultures? So diasporas, refugees and others, how do they question our attachment to native and nativeness? Third, how do people on the move construct or remember and lay claim to particular places of homelands and nations? And finally, what are the taken for granted ways of thinking about identity and territory that are reflected in the ordinary language or nationalist discourse and scholarship on nations and refuge that are sometimes even reproduced in a quest to fight what we recognize as xenophobia today, what is glossed over when we take the citizen subject as the normative subject? The interrogation of this link between people and places involves questioning the botanical metaphors that naturalize the relationship between people and place, the arborescent culture that privileges roots and rootedness of the soil, and the cultures of the home and the ideal of the home, as well as the genres of being that privilege purity, non-contamination, and even eugenics. Yeah, here eugenics isn't only about thinking about bloodlines. Yeah, the notion of being well-born and ill-born is also located to place. To be well-born is to be born here. To be ill-born is to be born in another land or under a different sun. Orientations that remain hostile to the foreignness that is always part of our existence today. In short, questioning roots and rootedness, questioning our familiar orientation to foreignness involves questioning the identity-saturated site of certainty, which is the home and the culture of the home. For some, this involves acknowledging their own foreignness in the place that they have settled and taken root in. For some, it involves tracing the path of displacement and estrangement, the flight and homelessness. We have to be historical, we can't be presentist. So questions of slavery and others have to be raised when we're thinking about migration today. And homelessness, and making a claim to a place that they're told they are perpetual strangers, they can never be at home in. In these instances, or most instances, the quest to live with another becomes a call to decolonize as a path to generating a less xenophobic, or even one might say philobarbaric ethics of cohabitation. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was a lot of food for thought, and I'll throw this food immediately at Natalia, of course, who will provide her own perspective on this, and then we'll cook it together with Leilane and later on with the wider audience, hopefully. Thank you so much again, Sam, and please, Natalia, welcome again. Welcome back. Always good to see you, and please, you have the word.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Florian, for the lovely introduction. Thank you so much, Sam, for your brilliant presentation. I hope mine resonates a little bit with yours. So I will read, so to make sure that I stick to time. When describing or thinking about how race, class, and the global refugee regime interconnect, we are almost immediately taken to the images of horse-mounted border officers whipping incoming Haitians at the US southern border in 2021. We are reminded of the thousands of Africans who either drowned in the Mediterranean or were returned by the Frontex to Libya, only to then be imprisoned in its horrifying detention centers. We remember the endless incarceration of asylum seekers in Pacific Islands by Australia, or the most recent UK-Rwanda deal to ship off any asylum seeker who shows up on the British coast illegally. Indeed, such examples are demonstrations of what Nicholas de Genova called the racial global divide, or what Tendai Chiumi framed as racial borders, wherein the current international border system privileges whiteness in the international mobility regime. Mobility, of course, goes beyond the global refugee frameworks. However, the greater or fewer possibilities of mobility determines more or less possibilities to seek protection internationally. All of the examples above demonstrate a racialized carceral border regime that affected non-white forced migrants seeking protection internationally. In other words, a regime that makes some individuals more or less immobile than others. I frame this regime as carceral because it produces immobility, be it in the closure of borders, lack of availability of visa waivers, impossible visa thresholds, detention mechanisms, overextended waiting periods, amongst other technologies. And it is also racialized because the selection of those mostly affected by it is racially determined. And this is particularly clear in South-North migration corridors, with its over-restrict migration regimes, which have historically worsened after Europeans were no longer the majority of refugees, i.e., after the decolonization of Africa and Asia, and the consequent greater numbers of formerly colonized subjects fleeing to their former colonial metropoles. This is also seen in the Americas as a reaction to US imperialism, where in decades of military and economic intervention and exploitation, for example, in Haiti and Central America, created historical migration corridors of the imperial subjects to the imperial nation, the United States, only to then be met with doors shut. Haitians, for instance, have historically fled to the US for protection from authoritarian regimes that were supported by the US in the first place. Instead, and I quote Naomi Paik in here, from the first arrival of Haitian boat people in the 60s in the United States, the country has rejected these refugees' claims almost wholesale, eventually instituting in 1978 a distinctive anti-asylum policy that involved interdiction, imprisonment, denial of due process, and repatriation of Haitians. Indeed, it is because the United States has fostered Haiti's unlivable conditions that it refuses to recognize Haitians' claims. Because the United States supported Haiti's violently repressive governments that serviced exploitative economic structures and Cold War ideologies, that it made the Haitian refugee an impossibility. HIV-positive Haitian asylum seekers were even sent off to Guantanamo way before Australia had even considered sending its refugees and asylum seekers to nearby Pacific islands. Seeing the images of Haitians stranded at the US southern border being whipped by horse-mounted border officers does not come as a surprise. In a way, it reflects an ongoing and continuous project which sustains an unequal, racialized, and carceral mobility in asylum regimes that affects mostly the non-white in displacement. Or in other words, the footprint of imperial and colonial domination in the border and mobility regimes is not only a legacy we have moved away from, it is still a living reality for many. Indeed, the carceral and racialized international mobility regime has meant an unequal and racialized access to international protection, including asylum. Possibilities to leave a country of origin, safely arrive at another country's borders, and be accepted as a refugee are highly racialized and dependent on the refugee's economic and financial possibilities to do so. And this is particularly salient when thinking about South-North mobilities, which involve distant countries and complex, strict asylum seekers, asylum and border regimes. Most importantly, it involves a more obvious racial global divide between mostly white countries where refugees are supposedly fleeing to from their mostly non-white origins. But as it is widely known, the majority of refugees are based in the global south. According to the UNHCR, Turkey hosts almost 4 million refugees, Colombia hosts 1.8 million, and Uganda and Pakistan host 1.5 million each. How is this unequal, carceral, and racialized mobility regime reflected in South-South mobilities? Does the racial global divide affect mobility in South-South corridors? Are there racial borders in place in the global South? These questions are the focus of what I would like to try and address here today. The global racial divide in the mobility and asylum regimes is seen in the global South through the enclosure of those considered undesirables or expendable in territories, detention centers, or refugee camps far from the borders of the global North, which are concentrated in the South. It is seen in the increasingly fewer resettlement quotas to more fairly distribute refugees from the global South to the global North. But it is also seen in how global South countries themselves manage their borders, implement their migratory and asylum systems, and control some displaced individuals at the expense of others, sometimes upholding colonial legacies. This was the case in Kenya. Odoloma Opi discovered how current refugee camps in Kenya have kept and are mirrored on former incarceration, forced labor, and torture camps, which were built by Great Britain to imprison anti-colonial political activists. He highlights how racial practices of social stratification and contention of political movements have been mirrored in post-colonial Kenya in a clearly anti-refugee policy inherited from former colonizers. In South Africa, before it became independent from the British colonial rule, there was a hierarchical difference between the non-white free migrants and Black natives. Around 1910, the need for labor influenced the free migration of Indians to colonial South Africa. Seen as a problem, European colonial authorities hoped to curb the presence of these Indian migrants, avoiding the overextension of their presence and willing for it to become only a temporary state. The Europeans in South Africa at that time were seen as settlers, and differently from Indians, which were seen as migrants, settler was a term that was related to their superior colonial claim to the land. Settlers were ontologically white and indicated civilizational superiority as opposed to the Indian migrants. As such, The term settler was already arranged in a hierarchical and competing order of occupancy. Faced with discriminatory laws and practices against Indian migrants' permanence in South Africa, Indians started to assume the term settler as their own identity. Indians claimed and adapted the term to emphasize their own contributions and perpetuity in South Africa. But in their claims to become settlers, as Renisa Mawani highlights, Indians created an anti-Black discourse which emphasized their long histories in South Africa, their future investments in the development of the land through their labor, but especially they based their claims to become settlers on their racial superiority over the Aboriginal races of Africa. Unsurprisingly, in post-apartheid South Africa, migratory policies had only a tiny or subtle change and reflected the decades of boosting white settlers throughout the 20th century and only accepting Black migrants under temporary schemes. Its legal migratory frameworks, including its policy on entry and on residence, temporary migration, permanent residence, and until recently, refugee status determination, had fallen under the Aliens Control Act. The act was conceptualized to primarily exclude the entry of Indians in the case of the first part of the 20th century, Jews during the Second World War, and communists, especially during the Cold War. The act provided a broad range of discretion to the government to accept and exclude migrants. In practice, it primarily operated to exclude Black migrants. It is thus unsurprising, thinking about the continuities of colonial legacies and anti-Blackness, that in 2008, residents of Alexandra Township in South Africa turned on their neighbors. Violence spread quickly. In a fortnight, citizens murdered more than 60 people, raped dozens, wounded closer to 700 people, and displaced more than 100,000, the majority of which were migrants, but also included South Africans who were married to foreigners. As Lauren Landau cited, when the army arrived, most of the offending outsiders had already been cleansed from their hostile communities, and the belligerents slipped silently back into the township's embrace. In 1998, a mob of unemployed South Africans demonstrating against the presence of foreigners in the country murdered one Mozambican and two Senegalese asylum seekers who were scraping a living selling sweets to passengers. The public response was muted, and the victims were Black foreigners. As Innocent Moyo and Christopher Nshimbi discuss, the events in post-apartheid South Africa seem to be in tandem with how African immigrants have been constructed and consequently attacked in xenophobic outbursts. This construction suggests that the African immigrants are not valuable members of South African society and deserve interpellation and evisceration. The way in which African immigrants are constructed constitutes a major factor that contributes to xenophobia. I do not intend to delve more deeply on these internal issues in relation to the dynamics of violence against foreigners in South Africa, but I want to use it to say that these factors, when analyzed combined, both the legal factors and the outbursts of violence and the hierarchical racial differences in colonial times, they highlight the effects of the racial global divide and how it also affects international mobility of non-white, but particularly Black migrants and asylum seekers, and their ability to live with dignity and effectively find protection in a country of asylum in the global South. Precisely in the cases of countries where colonial legacies influence the governance of borders, migrants, and refugees. Brazil is no different. In 1835, Law No. 9 of the state of Bahia was created under the pretext to make the prohibition of slave trade more effective. Its main goal, however, was to deport freed Africans in Salvador, the state's capital, during some of its slave revolts. According to Luciana Brito, 20% of Salvador's freed Africans, which were around 5,000 individuals, were deported to West Africa after the publication of this law until its expiration in 1872. However, even after it was expired, this law was also used to deport free Black Africans which arrived in the state's ports, as many did for legal trade. It was common in that time until more or less 1890 that there was a route from Bahia to Lagos to sell products for candomblé, for language learning, amongst other things. In 1877, 5 years after the expiration of Law No. 9, 16 free Black Africans that arrived with a British passport, because they were British subjects then, arrived at the port of Salvador from Lagos, which is now in Nigeria. The port police did not allow these individuals to disembark, and they used Law Number 9 to later deport them. In fact, Luciana Brito found that deportation was the main device used by local authorities to be rid of foreigners, especially Africans, and it didn't matter whether or not the laws that they applied to justify deportation, if they were expired or not. This is only a piece of Brazilian history that demonstrates that its history is a history of privileging non-Black migrants of all origins, so Chinese, Japanese, but especially white Europeans, of privileging these non-Black migrants, whilst specifically refusing the interests of Black individuals, and again, of all origins. Whilst not overtly racially based, Brazil's asylum histories also reveal a preference for white refugees, having only lifted the geographical limitation of the 1951 Refugee Convention in 1989. If those that don't know, the geographical limitation was lifted internationally in 1967, so it was over 20 years later than the world had lifted it in a way. The geographical limitation meant that only Europeans could be officially recognized as refugees. In the 1990s, for the first time since its independence, Brazil allowed a number of Black asylum seekers to enter and apply for asylum. It was still a small number. 2,000 Angolas had been recognized as refugees in a whole decade. Refusal of these claims, however, were considerably high considering the low numbers of Angolas arriving. In some points, they were almost at 50% rejection rate, as Regina Petrus found. Numbers of asylum seekers and refugees, particularly sub-Saharan Africans, which were the majority then, remained relatively low until the arrival of Haitians in 2010. Even then, when Haitians arrived, Brazil's response was ambivalent. While refusing refugee status to Haitian migrants almost immediately, Brazil also created a humanitarian visa. Initially, this humanitarian visa, though, had a cap number in order to allow entry, but only at a controlled pace. Let them come, but not as refugees, and not en masse, as many internal meetings of the country's Refugee Committee and Immigration Council highlight. At the same time, the country's border diplomacy worked tirelessly against Haitians' voluntary arrivals at the land border, and a wall of visas was created to curb land arrivals in the north of the country. As a result of Brazil's border diplomacy strategy, Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador started asking visas for Haitians, making their mobility throughout the region yet more difficult and dangerous, something which has a special impact now that a new migration corridor has been established, that is, from South America to Mexico and the US. Sub-Saharan Africans, although a significant number of asylum applications, especially before the arrivals of Venezuelans, although they had this significant number of arrivals, they also had one of the highest rates of refusals, as well as one of the longest waiting times for a decision in their asylum claims. In one case, a former asylum seeker, which was represented by me, left Brazil as he was tired of waiting. 5 years were not enough for a decision. He fled to the US on foot in the incredibly dangerous journey through the Darien Gap that is now a common pathway of Haitians and Africans formerly based in South America. Why are they leaving? As Brazil and South American countries in general globally boast their welcoming frameworks and their ability to protect those in need, thousands are abandoning their former places of residence. What does it say about our ability to protect? Economic crisis in the continent is an important reason, but only a partial explanation. Through its hidden bureaucracies, Brazil and other South American countries particularly affect asylum seekers, and in the case of Brazil, mainly sub-Saharan Africans, with extensive waiting times, many of which have never actually officially gained protection. Difficulties in bringing their family, as Brazilian consular posts make family reunification an impossible task for refugees' families members, as Patricia Martuselli found. Access to visas is also very difficult to reach, to find, and then to reach Brazilian territory. And great numbers of sub-Saharan Africans have to arrive undocumented, having paid high quantities for smugglers. Lack of prospects, discrimination, and violence, which particularly target Black migrants, as the murder of Moise demonstrates, are also what shapes the undesirability of Black migrants and demonstrate the continuous anti-Blackness that structures migratory and asylum practice in Brazil, which not only highlight contemporary patterns, but demonstrates the colonial continuities of anti-Black migratory and asylum frameworks. And to finish, as seen, the Global South upholds the racialized carceral mobility and asylum regime. It's not exclusive to the Global North. And it targets non-white and in some cases, mainly Black migrants and asylum seekers as victims of forced immobility. And they do that through extended and unequal waiting times, untargeted discrimination, violence, and xenophobia, the use of colonial-founded torture camps as refugee camps, discriminatory practices, especially in border areas, which are also racially based, the use of walls of visas, as I name it, to discourage and prevent the uncontrolled arrival of asylum seekers, amongst other technologies. All in all, non-white asylum seekers who wish to use South-South mobility pathways to reach protection still need to, in most cases, use irregular, dangerous, and expensive pathways to do so, are met with contempt, in some cases violence, face intense and unequal bureaucracy in internal asylum and visa procedures, and have high rejection rates in asylum claims. As such, even in the south corridors of migration, non-white and mostly Black migrants and asylum seekers are continuously, even if in different ways, seen and treated as the undesired migrants against which a carceral and racialized mobility and asylum regimes structures the nature of their reception and unequally affects their ability to live with dignity. I want to finish with a question, a broad one, a rhetorical one, so we can think of that maybe resonate with what Sam exposed and finished as well. How do we produce ruptures to the colonial continuities that continue to affect migrants' reception? How do we fight and challenge the inherent anti-Blackness that is structure migratory and refugee reception in the Global South? And to maybe resonate a little bit more with Sam, I have added, how do we conceptualize a type of hospitality that constitute a rupture to these colonial continuities? Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Natalia. Another great food for thought. And we're accumulating here dishes, so to speak, for our discussion. Thanks so much again. And I'll pass the word immediately to Leilane, who I think has in between managed to stabilize her internet connection. We're very glad about that. So Leilane, please, the word is yours, and then we'll have, as I said, a brief round of mutual replicas by the panelists, and then we will also open for questions by the audience. I'm monitoring here the questions in the chat, and there's already a couple, so please feel secure. I'm aware of them. I'm noting them down, and we will pass them on to the panelists when we get to that stage. And please feel absolutely free to put your comments and or questions in the chat. Please, Leilane.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Florian. Well, I want to thank you for the invitation to be here. I hope you all can understand my accent. I'm going to read my presentation, but let me know if you don't understand something, because we can talk at the end. So I'm a lawyer. I'm also a researcher from Resama. I'm going to speak a little bit about Resama because it is an important network of experts, researchers, and we are all working for the visibility, recognition, and the protection of people displaced and at a risk in the context of disasters and climate change. So through research, capacity building, and advocacy, we have been working to include the topic of environmental migration or environmental refugee in public agendas in the regions, integrating climate change, disasters, migration law, policies, agenda with a human rights approach. So I'm here, I'm going to talk in a different perspective of my colleagues, because I'm going to focus on environmental migration. And I will try to call attention for this kind of mobility. So there is a big divergence if the displaced people around climate change, about environmental issues, if they should be understood as refugee or not, especially since the term environmental climate refugee is totally popularized. So you can see this term everywhere when people talk about this issue. But the refuge is protected, especially by the Convention of 51, the Refugee Statute, which sets guidelines on who is the one that fits into this classical definition. So the displaced person do a well-founded fear of being persecuted for belonging to special social groups, for his religion, political opinion, race, or nationality. This person is forced to cross borders and fears to return to his country because this return may cause risk to his life. There is no flexibility here, therefore, to understand that the convention could frame climate and environmental cause as reason for a refugee status. It also happens when we are looking to Cartagena Convention. This Cartagena Convention, it has a more extensive definition, understanding that massive human rights violation or other circumstance that have serious disturbed public order are also reasons for refugee status. However, in practice, it is almost impossible to identify a case of environmental refugee recognition under the convention. For example, a widely publicized case was the one of Ione Teiota, who gained notoriety because the media said that he could be the first climate refugee case in the world. His request was based on the climate change in the Republic of Kiribati, which is facing rising sea levels as well as a lot of humanitarian issues and is in danger of disappearing. Because of the problem in his country, land conflicts, difficulty in finding drinking waters, and a lot of problems that happens over there could cause insecurity for his family. In 2015, Ioane Teiota presented to the United Nations Human Rights Committee a report on the violation of his right to life by New Zealand after the country rejected his application for environmental refugee status. However, there was no recognition of his refugee status. Among the reasons present, the court understood that it was really difficult to define the persecution, and also because they understand that Kiribati could adapt to climate change in the coming years. So in the end, the international human rights protection, the Convention of Refugee, and even the environmental agenda were inefficient to protect these environmental migrants, in this case, the case of Ione. After all, in their view, there was no persecution, there was no violation of the right to live, even when we are talking about a place that is no water, there is a lot of conflicts around water. And also one of the main reasons for the difficulty to broadening the concept is the complexity of the environmental migration. It is not only a sudden event that causes a group to move. The cause can be slow or sudden due to the droughts, floods, economic reasons that got worse by the initial climate cause, and also because of some kind of food vulnerability, because of development projects, whereas there is no participation of the local community in the decision-making process. Furthermore, it is necessary to point out the existing crisis around refuge, as my colleagues have just talked about. Many migrants do not want to be recognized as refugees. This can be very problematic definition, considering the exclusion and the xenophobia existing around the figure of the refugee. However, the lack of recognition of the environmental displaced creates a limbo of rights that often makes it difficult to rebuild their lives elsewhere. The situation is even more serious when we consider that the marginalized population who are on unequal terms of the rest of the societies are the ones who, in the majority, suffer from the impacts of natural disasters caused by humankind or not. The UN Special Reporter of the Extreme Poverty, Philip Alston, said in 2019 that we are in risk of a climate apartheid scenario where some people can pay to escape overheating, hunger, and conflict, but the rest of the world is left to suffer. Climate gentrification is already happening in a lot of cities, in a lot of coastal cities, in countries that still manage to adapt to the current scenario. And those cities, those countries, they are putting those who have always been put in risks areas, that are the Black people, the indigenous people, the non-white communities, that takes place in positions of vulnerability, which clearly shows the environmental and climate racism in cities. Also, for thousands of people, forced displacement leads to the crossing of borders at a time when the global community is put up even more walls for migrants considerable indesirable. I do not need to tell you the face of the displacement of those people that needs to move. However, the difficulty of defining developmental refugees makes it difficult to collect data, especially considering criteria of race, gender, or social class. But you know the face of these migrants, the face of Ione Teyota, that the case that I just told you about. Those are the people who are suffering from climate apartheid. Regarding environmental mobility, the number of displaced people exceeds those displaced by conflicts. The World Bank report last year predicts that by 2050, around 216 million people may become displaced for climate reasons. This prediction is also in line with the global climate crisis scenario as denounced by the International Panel of Climate Change. It is possible so to affirm that human activities influence the acceleration of global warming. Such projection will affect societies and consequently will cause even more impact on the immigration agenda. So the public policies in place are not enough. The legal instruments, they are vague, and it's not, those instruments, they not adapt as the speed required to mitigate the problems present in this agenda. So the law does not solve anything, but it also can be a valid instrument to restrain the construction of public policy for migrants. So how to respond to this mass displacement of people for environmental reasons? What is possible to do now with the instruments that we have, since actions must start right now? In this regard, perhaps we need to think about the rescue of the convention, of the refugee convention, to try to include the environmental refugee. But this is not a good answer, especially because this instrument was not built for them. In addition to the legal guidance, adaptation and recollocation policies and policies that listen to the affected community are essential for the due protection of the human rights of eventual environmental refugees. It is necessary to go beyond merely response to the disaster. After all, even in the current scenario where environmental and climate disasters affect everyone, part of the population is on the front line and lives a situation of climate injustice. In particular, here in Latin America, forced displacement especially affects the American and African American population, their territories, their way of lives. As disaster should not be seen as natural, because say that is natural ignores the political social aspects that are also structural in the region and increases the probability of an event with devastating consequences. It is necessary to promote the importance of acting in a preventive way in the areas of greatest risk. To do so, it is necessary to work with public, government, private, and especially civil society actors. In addition, for the elaboration of efficient public policies, it is necessary to put a perspective of the community. This is where law should be rethought and start from a perspective that puts in the first place the human rights of people who occupy vulnerable area, the human rights of Black and Indigenous population. And since there is a global legal normative vacuum that englobes environmental migration, there is an opportunity to build an instrument from a perspective that starts from the global south. So this is the general idea. I hope you could understand me. And I thank you so much for this opportunity.
Fantastic, Leilane. Thank you so much. So we now have a sort of a very complementary, very diverse and differentiated scenario. So why don't we do the following? So I have two, so far at least, two audience questions, and why don't we weave these audience questions into your, our reply, our first reaction round in a sense. So let me just paraphrase it in them in English. So just one second. So one is to what extent this came after Sam's presentation, but at the same time, I think you should all consider yourself queried in a sense, by all these questions. So the question was if one considers the refugee law, and this actually quite links to Natalia's presentation as well. So if we consider refugee law and institutions as a structure or a language, what would be its limits if one takes into consideration perspectives such as Jacques Derrida's idea of the stranger or strangeness, so to speak, and foreignness. Would it then, that is international refugee law, just a language of oppression and control question? Yeah, so that's one set of questions posed by Felipe. Thank you very much. And another question, just one second, is whether you think that the refugee regime is constructed in such a way to exclude other migrants. Is there a inclusion-exclusion process in these regimes? And are they somehow racialized? Yeah, that's in a sense a linked question. Yeah. And that is from, yes, I think I've just read it, that it's a question from Suzette. Thank you very much. Yeah. Again, you don't, obviously feel invited to respond to these questions, but also please react to each other. This would be great. And then once we are around again briefly, then we'll open it for any further questions. If there are any, please, in the meantime, of course, feel free to post anything here into the post. Okay, let's start with Sam again, please.
Oh, thank you. You've given me so much to think about. Thank you, Natalia and Leilane, and thanks for those who've posed questions. I'll respond to some of the questions while at the same time reflecting on the presentation. And I'll begin with one of the things that Natalia was pointing out is these global, the racial dynamics of the global mobility regime. Yeah, whether it's African migrants dying in Lampedusa, which the fact should not be lost to us that Lampedusa is geologically part of Africa, while geopolitically Europe. But some of this is also based on the externalization of migration control. Where the Italy externalizing migration control to Libya, and the fact should not be lost to us also what the idea of Africa that is at play here, and the idea of Europe that emerges, the idea of the Mediterranean world. How can a place that was historically a place of flows become a domain of containment, how Europe is able, in that very one move, present itself as a certain kind of moral subject, while at the same time presenting the domain of atrocity as Libya, without engaging, what fortress Europe does. And the refoulement, detention, interdiction at sea, all these legal issues that arise based on that idea of Europe that is being presented in that time. Elsewhere, I've written about this, and I try to say a hyperbolic ethics becomes necessary, in order to give us another language. Something like what Raphael Lemkin was doing around the end of World War II, when he says you have a crime without a name, and says you need genocide in order to be able to understand. I say that these types of crimes against people on the move, require migricide specifically to be able to see exactly what is happening on a violence that plays on territoriality and extraterritoriality. Thanks, Natalia, for talking about the Pacific solution, Guantanamo, and Natalia has also illustrated how this has connections to the environmental apartheid that is at place. But this is a violence that is also enabled by elastic and fragmentary border regimes or a border order, where not only places like Lampedusa become domains of death for migrants, but we see this happening in Comoros Island, because of parts of the Indian Ocean that are French departments, if you like. So Africans trying to reach these domains, and it doesn't make us ask those much more crucial questions, which for me goes back to where I was beginning with that theoretical question that will make us ask, how does the idea of Europe itself produce certain kinds of regime of death? The continuities that both Leilane and Natalia have managed to illustrate, that even where you have, for instance, Kenya, you gave the example, the Dadaab refugee camp that is in the northeastern Kenya. During colonialism, this was the northern frontier district, where it was to manage Somalis, to manage those people who are considered not proper citizens, not proper native. And in the post-colonial era, you have that being reproduced. The example that I was giving of the story of Weight of Whispers, as the story, it's Rwandese genocide in Nairobi. And again, we are seeing how this is played out in what the UK is doing today. Will you send migrants from the UK to places like Rwanda? Israel is also doing that. And for me, it raises those questions about the regime at play. Now, the very specific questions from the chat, whether refugee law is a language and a language of repression and control, don't want to focus only on its symbolic dynamics, but to engage very specifically how that language works, how the focus on well-founded fear, for instance, as pertains to race, religion, nationality, brings us to focus on very specific kinds of categories of fear in exclusion of all others. The Organization of African Unity, tried to do something different by talking about people compelled to leave, due to external aggression and other things, so that you have a broader category of what to be concerned with. But in all these interventions, the burden of refugee status determination, is still something that it's either the state doing, the certain state centrism, or what the UNHCR is doing. And that, for me, limits the way we are thinking about the problems, if you like, that pertain to migration regimes. So refugee is an important category, but it cannot be the place where we invest all our ethical and political orientation towards how to engage the problem of migration today. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sam. I think Leilane was temporarily abducted by aliens, but we're trying to rescue her. But in the meantime, Natalia, if you want to react to both Sam again and of course the others, Leilane, and also the questions.
Thank you so much for the questions, everyone. Suzachi and Felipe, and Sam, for your brilliant remarks. Thank you for that as well. I'm going to pick up from the last part that you were mentioning in the answer to Felipe. And I agree that the refugee is a concept that it has its uses and it's useful in a way, but and also maybe intertwining with the question that Suzachi made, it doesn't challenge any of the it doesn't challenge state authority over deciding who enters and who leaves, and therefore refugeehood is a legal but mostly a political concept because it's politically used, because executive governments can determine who enters and who leaves, and that leaves a whole space for discretionary decisions. So I wouldn't say, for example, and then addressing Suzachi's question, that the refugee regime was constructed in a way to exclude other migrants. We have to think about refugee history and refugeehood, how it is now, like the modern refugee system, let's say, that was built from 1951, was created to respond to a problem. And it was the European problem after the World Wars. So in that effect, it was useful, and it did what it was supposed to do. The problem is when it became a solution to one problem. We have to think about international law more broadly. It was a world in which there weren't as many states that we have now. So African states many of those hadn't decolonized, weren't independent states. Also, Asian states didn't exist at the time. So lots of states didn't even exist. And so when we think about it now, it was supposed to be only for Europeans. So if we think about it, yes, it excluded other possibly forced migrants, but they weren't even thought of. So we have to actually engage with Sam's first food for thought in terms of humanity. Who we have to think who they were considering even to be subjects of protection. And even though I think Brazil and Venezuela were parts of the 1951 convention, but apart from these two countries, there weren't hardly any other global South countries to give any input. And it can be used, refugee law and the refugee concept can be used to exclude other migrants. And it's definitely used. There's a wonderful book by Rebecca Hamlin, in which it's called Crossing, in which she addresses what she calls the refugee binary, so refugee and migrant, and how it is exploited by states to exclude those that they consider undesirable. So it's politically determined. And we have to think about that, engage with that when we not only think about refugee law academically, but also in our practice. I know that many that are watching practice refugee law on their day-to-day, so we have to think about it as well. And they're definitely racialized. So when we see data, for example, from Europe, the numbers started to restrict after the decolonization of African Asian, and when these migrants started to go to Europe. So numbers started to decrease quite substantially, and we have to think about it. Why is that? And we also have to think about that the refugee regime is not only refugee status determination procedures, it's connected to the global mobility regime. You cannot be a refugee if you cannot leave your country and cross some borders. So we have to think about them as interconnected, and that's why in engaging with what Leilane said, I don't know if she hears us or not, but
yes, here she is. Great, excellent.
But I think it's not a solution, but it could be one of the ways to think that goes beyond refugeehood, to think about environmental migrants, is to think about mobility rights, which we don't talk about. As far as we know, there's no mobility rights. There's no right to enter any country unless you're a national. So it's very much based on sovereignty, national, and we have to challenge these concepts, I think, to move forward, because we're talking about millions and millions of people. And another thing that I would like to say is that in some ways, what the theoretical framework that Tendai Chiumi created in terms of imperial subjects, in a way, she mentions how it doesn't even, we shouldn't even be talking about refugees or economic migrants when, for example, migrants leave from a country under imperial domination. So she, for example, exemplifies with imperial domination of the US in Nicaragua. So everything that makes these Nicaraguans move to the US, for example, it's as if when the US started to put their presence there militarily and economically, it's as if they kind of were broadening their own border. So they should be considered equal political subjects. So that could provide answers that she bases on law and international law to those cases in which, for example, environmental disasters are not coped in countries that have been under colonial or imperial subjugation. So I don't know. I think I may have crossed the line. I wish I could to address more with what Sam had said, but yeah, thank you.
Fantastic, Natalia. Thanks very much. Leilane, glad you could be rescued from the aliens that abducted you. But so I'll pass the word to you, and I addition a further question that's been posed just after your talk, again by Felipe. So do you see any progress in the multilateral negotiations on the UN? On the issue of environmental migration, are the regional initiatives better placed to deal with it? So please feel free, obviously, to react to the previous speakers as well, but also to this particular question. Please. Leilane, are you with us?
I think you froze.
Yes, that's true. It's we've all learned this during the pandemic. Now, it's super important to try to freeze in a sort of pensive, elegant pose. Nothing worse than to freeze in these embarrassing, So Leilane did that, a very elegant pose. Please, Leilane, did you hear the questions?
I couldn't listen to the question. I'm so sorry. It's raining a lot over here. I think that's why my connection is terrible. I'm using my cell phone all the time. I'm so sorry.
Can you hear me speaking now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. So just to reiterate, so obviously feel free to react to Samson and Natalia, and also to this question.
I'm sorry. I think it's better if I close my camera, if you don't mind, because it's like,
Right. Okay.
It's hard to understand. Oh, okay.
Okay.
Please.
So the question is, I'll read you the. So do you see any progress? Are you still with us?
Yes.
Right. Are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so do you see any progress on the multilateral negotiations at the UN on this issue, on the issue of environmental migration? Are the regional initiatives perhaps better placed to deal with it? That was a specific question posed in the meantime, but again, you feel free to also react to any other points, please.
Okay. Yes, it's way better now that I close my camera. And I'm so sorry because I couldn't understand a lot of the things that Sam and Natalia said because of my connection. So I lost a lot of the speech. And but about the question, I kind of see a progress, but not as it should be. When we think about the international agenda talking about the environmental issues, it's not focused on people. We may see some people talk about environmental racism, we can see, but it's not connected to migration. I think that in the international scenario, it's difficult to connect migration, environmental issues, and human rights. And if you see, for example, now in the negotiation that is going to happen, if you see at the agreements, only in 2018, I believe, that was the first time that they said about the environmental migration. The panel about the safety migration, something like that, but it was only in 2018. So this is an issue that we are facing right now, and one of the problems that the government says is that we can find ways to adapt. But who can find this way to adapt? Who are the countries that can do this? So if you're talking about United States, for example, look what's happening over there right now with the hurricane that is forcing a lot of people to displace. And the thing that is good to understand at this hurricane in Florida is happening in areas of migrants from Cuba, from countries that they were forced to go to the United States, and now they are forced to change again, and because of environmental issues. So that is like, okay, let's start to talk about the environmental migration in the international scenario, but it's not fast enough as it should be. It's like we are here talking in some small places, but we are not really doing something to change this reality. And so I think that's all. I think we may say that one of the reasons is because it's affecting Black and Indigenous people right now. Maybe it will happen. One day it will happen. It will affect the Europe as well. The people, the rich population as well, but not now. So it's like they are postponed the problem, and a lot of conflicts that are happening right now. It's because of the climate change. It's because of the environmental issues. So I don't think we really see an improvement in the international law, international configuration right now. I think it's more talk than action. So we have to start to think how to really prepare ourselves for the what is going on, and to protect ourselves and to protect our people, our community, and people that are already being affected right now.
Fantastic. Thanks, Leilane. Even invisibly, this was a great replique. And Sam, I think you want to come back. We have a couple of minutes still. I think we should be starting to wind down, but I'm very happy to also take any further questions from the audience. If anyone wants to put anything in the chat, please. And also, again, from the panel, Sam, you want to come back here, please.
Okay. Thank you, Leilane and Natalia, for your interventions. Leilane, while you're speaking, and especially when you're thinking about the response to the question about what the UN can do, and if the regional organizations are the best place to have responsive interventions. Just like what Natalia was illustrating, that even in a post-colonial era, you can have a continuity of colonial logics, colonial formations, and practices that are racial and racist. The same thing is required to understand what exactly is happening. For instance, you might see at the UN the push for resilience governance, a call for communities to, vulnerable communities to adapt to these conditions. And you're seeing this at play not only at that UN level, it's happening at the regional level, it's happening in communities. You go to the cities, the discourse at play in cities, where smart cities, resilient cities. So the language of resilience as an orientation, creating a particular kind of subject with vis-a-vis the threats that are perceived becomes the problem. And it's not only something that you can perceive if your analysis is of the institutions. Well, you have to be able to see how these logics play out at so many domains that even those who are seeking solutions, even alternatives, sometimes reproduce them. It's the same thing that happens when we think of humanitarianism. If we do not go to the core of what Didier Fassin will say, the ontology of inequality that is at the heart of humanitarian government, that you'll say that, okay, fine, the state is that entity that is causing the well-founded fear, and you consider this other domain as the solution, rather than seeing the very logics, the practices, the orientations that are at play. And each of these orientations do not believe in what Gugu Adiongo would say, the moral rightness of struggle. They generate very specific kinds of subjects. And for me, I think that's why it's important that while we recognize the problems they're solving, a critique and composing other worlds, other orientations becomes an equally urgent intervention at this point.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Natalia, do you want to come back? Leilane, briefly, very briefly?
That is nothing I want to say after Sam. He's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Excellent. So yes, I think so too. All of you are fantastic, in fact. I think we are right in time, and this is really good. We've had some engaging questions as well. I think this was really, really great. Thank you so much, Sam, Natalia, and Leilane, and thank you for the audience. Thank you for the questions. I think once again, this proves that the cátedras and the encontro of the cátedras once a year is a really important moment of, a breather, in a sense, of coming out of the day-to-day work on issues, migration and refugee, and taking a step back and reflecting on some of the work and some of the different facets and aspects of the work we do. I very much hope that we can all stay in touch, and I once again want to thank you profusely, and I think with that I'll hand back to the organizers, especially to Jean Horis, who is the fantastic soul in the background of this and so many other of the logistics here of this great conference. And I very much hope we can also be with Jean at one stage in Goiás and celebrate, in a sense, after the event, this really nice coming together. Thank you very much.